The concept of multiple Spider-Men has been done before, by the way, so not even that is an original idea that Miles brings to the table. And naturally, the Spider clones of old have fallen to the D-list of Marvel's roster, due to the reasons previously stated. Spider-Man's story is inherently a solo act.
Man, I already know this is going to be a very controversial video. I consider myself a pretty avid reader of comics, especially Spider-Man ones. And I always have to explain that when you get to the Clone Saga, it's really a matter of controversy because of how convoluted it is. You know, we're led at one point to believe that the Peter that we've been following for 20 years is possibly a clone. Of course, this gets rectified by the end of the story. But there's a small but pretty vocal fan base for that clone, Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider. Now, it is understood that Marvel experimented with the idea of having Ben Reilly replace Peter as Spider-Man. And fans did not react well to this. They thought it was a mistake. They didn't want to let go of Peter. But the idea behind replacing him is that Peter has grown up. He can have a happy ending with Mary Jane. And you can have this new Spider-Man who technically is him, but is more reminiscent of the Peter of the past who wasn't committed to something or someone and could actually kind of like free roam and be a loner. Now, I can understand where fans at the time thought they were, missing something by replacing their lead character. But as someone who has either read or been familiarized with many of the Spider-Man stories post the Clone Saga, I really don't think if Ben had replaced Peter, we would actually be missing much. So for me, and this is all based just in my opinions, Spider-Man comics have been ranging from mediocre to just god-awful ever since 2007's One More Day. There were some things I didn't like before that. Again, a good chunk of the Clone Saga. The horrific story with Gwen and the Goblin having kids, which was actually retconned later on, but still, there were always little piles of just crap, right? But again, we've been in this period that for over 10 plus years has mostly seen bad Spider-Man stories in my view. And I will maintain that Dan Slott is one of the worst writers to have ever worked for any comic book company. Which is why, in retrospect, I don't see Ben replacing Peter as a bad thing. Because the stories they've told with Peter since have really not been that good. In fact, I would actually say One More Day and its destruction of Peter's marriage was an attempt to make Peter more like Ben by having him no longer married, single. And this is something that likely would not have happened if they had actually allowed Ben to replace Peter in a sense. Let me kind of elaborate here. When I say replace Peter, I'm not talking about what they tried to do, which is make him the new Spider-Man. I'm thinking of something similar to basically taking that position of the person with the spider powers who we see more often than the other. So if I had my way at the time, I probably would cancel Amazing Spider-Man, just have it end with Peter moving with Mary Jane, living happily ever after. And in its place, you have a Scarlet Spider ongoing series, which tells Ben's adventures living in, either some other city, some other country, wherever he could be. And you would have Spider-Man stories set in the same 616 universe, but they would be limited series. Like you would see a new Spider-Man series, limited series probably every 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And the idea is that Peter is semi-retired. If there's a threat that's big enough, right? Some new major villain has come to wreak havoc. He'll join the Avengers or X-Men or whichever other team, or even Ben to quell this threat. And the way this would go is that you would have, when it comes to Marvel's ongoing series, the ones that were already around: X-Men, Fantastic Four, Hulk, Daredevil, Captain America, Iron Man, and then Scarlet Spider. Also Thor, but that's already there. But the idea, again, is that Scarlet Spider would be their new Spider-Man without actually being Spider-Man. He would be a character with similar powers who is a clone of Peter, but who has, again, his own moniker and identity, and hopefully his own villains as well. And let me also just say this. I always think about Batman Beyond and how you had this show that under almost no circumstance should have worked, right? Warner Brothers wanted a teenage Batman, and Bruce Timm had the idea of, okay, we'll have a teenage Batman, but it's not Bruce Wayne, and we'll give him all these different new characters. And really, that's what I think is so sad about Ben, where you start this off, like just picturing Scarlet Spider issue 1, you already have traces of a character arc. What is it like to be a clone? What is it like to be someone else and have their memories, but to have not actually lived through it? Are you resentful of the person that you're a clone of? Do you want to be more like the person you're a clone of? Do you want to carve out your own identity? Do you want to keep the things that are good, delete the things that are bad? That is a character arc that could have been used for 10 or 20 years right there. And if you put Ben in some other city that's not New York, because while I like New York, the actual city in real life, it is kind of, I'd say, overused in Marvel, but that's just my opinion. Whatever. But if you put him in some other setting, we can have a new supporting cast, new villains, and maybe he doesn't go to college. Maybe he's not a photographer. There are so many setups that you can create just from the basic thread of, this is Peter's clone, and that's it. Like, that's the only thing we're forced to have as our starting point. And we can just paint a blank canvas with everything else. And I should also say that when I think of Miles, who I'm not as big a fan of, I know he's a more popular character than Ben, I will readily admit that, but I hope people can understand my perspective. I loved Ultimate Spider-Man. It was probably my favorite run of the character besides the original Lee Ditko and Romita runs, like that original 100-something issues. So to take who I thought was the most developed version of Peter in any of the comics besides the actual 616 version and kill him off and replace him with some new character that appeared out of the blue, it just didn't sit well with me. And I do believe that, again, the Spider-Verse movies have made Miles a better character, but I also think that he's another victim of this same problem where, okay, this character is the new Spider-Man, they have the same or similar powers to Peter, but do you actually try to make them unique? And Miles, unfortunately, just was never able to carve out a path of his own. I never thought his relationships with his parents were that developed. I didn't like that they recycled a bunch of Spider-Man villains for him, and they still do that with, even with Spider-Verse, with Spot, and, and Kingpin, for example. And I do think that I'm more okay with, Ben in this hypothetical scenario I'm bringing up, because even if he is technically becoming Marvel's main Spider-Man, he's still not actually taking the mantle of Spider-Man. Like, I think Miles would have been better off as a separate identity, but whatever, I can accept he's a Spider-Man. Now, when it comes to other media, people might get worried. They might say, oh, if we had Scarlet Spider as Marvel's, new Spider-Man, and Spider-Man was just a limited series, prior to the end of the 90s or the start of the 2000s, then what's going to happen with the Raimi trilogy and TASM and, all this other stuff? And here's what needs to be understood. Most Spider-Man media tends to adapt things that happened in the first 30-something issues, the original Lee Ditko run. Raimi stopped reading Spider-Man comics a long time before the Clone Saga. He stopped reading before Venom even appeared. So I have no reason to believe that if Scarlet Spider was either the main Spider-Man for a few years, or up until 2000 or 2001, that Sony would be like, oh yeah, let's just not do Spider-Man, even though he was Marvel's more recurring and regular version of that character for years. Because think about it, there's a lot of media with Barry Allen as the Flash during the period where Wally West was the Flash. So it's really not something that would actually be that big of a deal. Just like Miles would definitely not be impacted by by Scarlet Spider being the replacement for Peter in this alternate universe, because Ultimate Spider-Man could still come out when it did, and what was that, like 2000? And I think it would actually sell better if it was the first monthly Spider-Man comic since TASM stopped being a regular monthly comic. That people would be more excited for it because there aren't multiple Spider-Man books going at once. Now, I played that clip when this started, just so we can all tie this together, about Spider-Man as a solo act, because I wanted to illustrate that having two Spider-Man does not inherently mean that same rule can't apply. Ben as Scarlet Spider does not have to be in regular contact with Peter. He does not have to be a member of the Avengers or any of these other groups. He can completely operate by himself, have stories to himself, and it's just not, it's not written anywhere that he has to interact with the rest of the Marvel universe. I'm sure if they do these big giant crossovers, he'll be involved, but I mean, at that point, that's just a prerequisite of being in a universe. So yeah, I think Ben is one of Marvel's most wasted characters, both in comics and other media. I think the only other characters that I would say had as much potential as him and just got squandered would probably be maybe Carol Danvers back when she was Miss Marvel and She-Hulk. Like it's a really slim list in terms of characters that really could have brought something to the table that they just glossed over. So I hope you enjoyed my ramblings, and thanks for watching.